Hitler was the monster other monsters were scared of. His family, on the other hand, had a different story. While Paula and Heinrich Hitler supported him and stood by him until the end, William Patrick Hitler stood up against his uncle's cruel regime and fled to America. Let's break down their stories. Paula Hitler, the sister who defended the monster. Paula Hitler, born in 1896, was Hitler's younger sister and the last member of the immediate Hitler family to bear the notorious surname. Throughout the war years, Paula had maintained a deliberately low profile, working as a secretary in Vienna, while her brother orchestrated the systematic murder of millions. She had limited contact with Hitler during his rise to power, but received substantial financial support from him, including over 100,000 Reichsmarks in 1945. This financial arrangement would later become a source of intense scrutiny for Allied investigators, who questioned whether Paula had been complicit in her brother's crimes or merely a beneficiary of his ill-gotten gains. When the Third Reich crumbled in the spring of 1945, Paula found herself in an impossible position. During the ending days of the war, at the age of 49, she was driven to Berchtesgaden, Germany, apparently on the orders of Martin Bormann. Paula was arrested by US intelligence officers in May 1945 and debriefed later that year. She characterized her childhood relationship with her brother as one of both frequent bickering and strong affection. Perhaps most remarkably, Paula maintained her defense of Adolf even after learning the full scope of the Holocaust. She told them she could not believe her brother had been responsible for the Holocaust. The practical consequences of being Hitler's sister were immediate and severe. She told them the Soviets had confiscated her house in Austria, the Americans had expropriated her Vienna apartment, and that she was taking English lessons. After her release from American custody, Paula attempted to rebuild her life from nothing. She was released from American custody and returned to Vienna, where she lived on her savings for a time, then worked in an arts and crafts shop. By 1952, Paula had made the decision to retreat from public life entirely. In 1952, Paula Hitler relocated to Berchtesgaden, reportedly living in seclusion in a two-room flat as Paula Wolf. The choice of surname was no coincidence. Wolf was Adolf Hitler's self-adopted nickname. In February 1959, she agreed to be interviewed by Peter Morley, a documentary producer for British television station Associated Rediffusion. Paula, Adolf's last surviving sibling, died on 1st June 1960 at the age of 64. She died unmarried and childless, taking with her the final direct link to Adolf Hitler's immediate family. Paula's death marked the end of one chapter of the Hitler family story, but across the Atlantic Ocean, another branch of the family was writing a very different narrative of resistance and redemption. William Patrick Hitler, the nephew who fought against the Reich. Born in Liverpool, England in 1911, William Patrick Hitler was the son of Alois Hitler Jr. from his first marriage to Brigitte Dowling. His very existence seemed to embody the international scope of Hitler's family connections, a living reminder that the reach of the Hitler bloodline extended far beyond German borders. William's early life was marked by the absence of his father, who had abandoned the family to return to Germany. As a result of Alois Jr.'s decision to desert his first wife, Brigitte Dowling, Dowling would raise their son alone in North London, England, while being supported by her family in Ireland. This abandonment would prove fortuitous, as it meant William grew up in a democratic society, far from the toxic ideology that would eventually consume his uncle. As Adolf Hitler's political star began to rise in the 1920s and early 1930s, William found himself in the unique position of being simultaneously related to and fascinated by his increasingly famous uncle. William moved to Germany in the 1930s, but grew disillusioned with his uncle Adolf, whom he criticized publicly. This disillusionment wasn't merely political, it was deeply personal, as William witnessed firsthand the transformation of a family member into a demagogue. William's criticism of his uncle was not merely private grumbling, it was public and increasingly bold. Willie had publicly criticized his uncle by 1938, at a time when such criticism within Nazi Germany could easily result in imprisonment or death. Recognizing that his position in Nazi Germany was becoming untenable, William made the momentous decision to flee to America. He emigrated to the US in 1939, just months before his uncle would plunge the world into war. After the war, William faced the same challenge that confronted all of Hitler's relatives: how to build a life while carrying the world's most infamous surname. His solution was both practical and symbolic. He changed his name to William Stewart Houston in 1947. William's post-war life represented a deliberate embrace of American normalcy. He married Phyllis Jean-Jacques in 1947 and settled on Long Island, New York, where he worked as a medical lab technician. William and Phyllis had 4 sons: Alexander Adolf Stuart Houston, born 1949, Louis Stuart Houston, born 1951, Howard Ronald Stuart Houston, born 1957, and Brian William Stuart Houston, born 1965. William Patrick Hitler died on July 14, 1987, at age 76, having successfully built a life that was the antithesis of everything his uncle represented. While William found redemption through resistance, another Hitler nephew would face a far more tragic fate, becoming a casualty of the very ideology that his half-uncle had created. Heinrich Heinz Hitler, the true believer who paid the ultimate price. In the tragic tapestry of Hitler family history, perhaps no story is more heartbreaking than that of Heinrich Heinz Hitler, a young man whose fervent belief in his half-uncle's ideology ultimately led to his destruction. Born on March 14, 1920, Heinrich Heinz Hitler was the son of Alois Hitler Jr. from his second marriage to Hedwig Heidemann. Unlike his half-brother William Patrick, who would flee Nazi Germany and fight against it, Heinz embraced the Nazi cause with the passionate intensity that only youth can muster. The ultimate test of Heinz's commitment came with Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. He participated in the invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa. This massive military operation, launched on June 22, 1941, was intended to be Hitler's crowning achievement, the conquest of the Soviet Union and the establishment of German living space in the East. For Heinz, participation in this campaign represented the chance to fight for his half-uncle's vision of German destiny. However, the reality of warfare on the Eastern Front was far more brutal than Nazi propaganda had prepared Heinz to expect. The Soviet resistance was fierce, and German forces found themselves in an increasingly desperate situation as winter approached. On 10th of January 1942, he was captured by Soviet forces. The date is significant. This was during the period when German forces were suffering massive casualties and retreating from Moscow, their dreams of quick victory shattered by Soviet resistance and the brutal Russian winter. Heinz's capture marked the beginning of a nightmare that would last barely more than a month. He was sent to the Moscow military prison Butyrka, a fortress-like institution that had become synonymous with Soviet political repression. For the Soviets, capturing Hitler's nephew must have seemed like a propaganda goldmine. Here was living proof that even Hitler's own family was not immune to the consequences of his aggressive war. The treatment Heinz received in Soviet captivity reflected both the brutality of the Eastern Front and the particular hatred the Soviets felt for anything connected to Hitler. He died, aged 21, after interrogation and torture. Heinz died in Butyrka prison on February 21, 1942, just 6 weeks after his capture. The speed of his death suggests that his captors were more interested in punishment than in extracting useful intelligence. While Heinz's story ended in a Soviet prison, another Hitler nephew would also find himself caught in the crossfire between the two great dictatorships of the 20th century, though his fate would be markedly different. Leo Rudolf Raubal Jr., the nephew caught between two dictators. Among Hitler's relatives, few faced circumstances as dramatically tragic as Leo Rudolf Raubal Jr., a man whose life became a pawn in the larger struggle between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Leo Rudolf Raubal Jr., born in 1906, was the son of Angela Hitler and Leo Raubal Sr., making him Adolf Hitler's nephew through his half-sister. However, the fortunes of war would place Leo in one of the most deadly campaigns in human history. The Battle of Stalingrad, which began in August 1942, represented Hitler's desperate attempt to capture the city that bore Stalin's name and secure German control over the Volga River. Leo was wounded in January 1943 during the Battle of Stalingrad, joining the hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who became casualties in what would become the turning point of the war in Europe. In this desperate situation, the fact that Leo was Hitler's nephew briefly elevated him above the anonymous mass of German soldiers fighting and dying in the ruins of Stalingrad. Friedrich Paulus asked Hitler for an airplane to evacuate Raubal to Germany. The request by the commanding general of the 6th Army represents an extraordinary intervention on behalf of a single soldier, demonstrating both the special status Leo enjoyed due to his family connection and the desperate nature of the German situation. Hitler refused, and Raubal was captured by the Soviets on 31st of January 1943. Recognizing the potential value of holding Hitler's nephew prisoner, Hitler attempted to negotiate an exchange that would bring Leo home. Hitler gave orders to check the possibility of a prisoner exchange with the Soviets for Stalin's son Yakov Djugashvili, who was in German captivity since 16th of July 1941. However, Stalin's response to Hitler's proposal revealed the Soviet leader's own ruthless approach to family and politics. Stalin refused to exchange him either for Raubal or for Friedrich Paulus, and said, "War is war." Leo's fate in Soviet captivity remained uncertain for more than a decade. Leo was imprisoned until 1955, despite Hitler's failed attempts to negotiate his release. release. When Leo was finally released in 1955, he returned to a world that had been completely transformed by the war and its aftermath. He had a son, Peter, born in 1931. Leo died on August 18, 1977, at age 70, having survived both the Battle of Stalingrad and 12 years in Soviet labor camps. Leo's son, Peter, would inherit this burden of survival, becoming one of the quiet guardians of the Hitler family's attempt to disappear into anonymity, while another branch of the family chose a very different approach to their infamous heritage. Angela Hitler, the half-sister who profited from evil. Angela Hitler, born in 1883, was Hitler's half-sister from his father's second marriage. Angela's early life seemed destined for domestic obscurity. Angela married Leo Raubal Sr. in 1903 and had 3 children. As a widow with children to raise, Angela found herself in the challenging position of needing both income and security when her half-brother began his meteoric rise to political prominence. Her solution would tie her fate inextricably to the Nazi regime. Angela served as Hitler's housekeeper in the 1920s and 1930s, a role that placed her at the center of his domestic life during some of the most crucial years of his political ascent. This position gave her unprecedented access to Hitler's private world, making her one of the few people who witnessed both his public persona and his personal habits. However, this intimate access came with a price. She became increasingly entangled in the web of relationships and dependencies that surrounded the future Führer. Angela became estranged over Hitler's relationship with Eva Braun, a conflict that speaks to the complex mix of family loyalty, moral concern, and personal jealousy that characterized their relationship. For Angela, who had served as the primary female figure in Hitler's domestic life, the arrival of Eva Braun represented not just a romantic rival, but a fundamental shift in the family hierarchy. Despite this estrangement, during the war, she reconnected with him and was evacuated to Berchtesgaden in 1945. This reconciliation suggests that family bonds, however strained, ultimately proved stronger than personal disagreements. Hitler's decision to evacuate Angela to safety as the Reich collapsed demonstrates that he still felt some responsibility for her welfare, even after years of tension. After the war, Angela faced the same challenges as other Hitler family members in dealing with their notorious connection. Post-war, she sold her memoirs and spoke positively of Hitler, claiming ignorance of the Holocaust. Her decision to monetize her experiences and maintain her defense of Hitler represents one approach to handling the family legacy: capitalization rather than repudiation. Angela's final years were spent in the shadow of her half-brother's crimes, yet she maintained her loyalty to the end. Angela died of a stroke on October 30, 1949, at age 66. Her death marked the end of another direct link to Hitler's pre-war life, taking with her memories of a man before he became a monster. While Angela chose to profit from her connection to Hitler, another family member would take the opposite path, abandoning the family name entirely and building a life based on rejection of everything Hitler represented. Alois Hitler Jr., the half-brother who escaped. Alois Hitler Jr., born in 1882, was Hitler's half-brother from the same marriage as Angela. From his earliest years, Alois Jr. demonstrated the independent spirit that would ultimately save him from the fate that befell other family members. Alois Jr. had a strained relationship with their father and left home young. This early departure from the family household meant that he was already establishing his own identity and life path before Adolf began his political career, a timing that would prove crucial to his survival. Alois Jr.'s romantic life was as complicated as his relationship with his family. He married Brigitte Dowling in 1910, divorced later, and Hedwig Heidemann in 1916, bigamously fathering 2 sons. Professionally, Alois Jr. chose a path that kept him in the commercial rather than political sphere. He ran a restaurant in Berlin, a business that required him to interact with the public daily while maintaining the delicate balance of bearing the Hitler name without embracing the Hitler ideology. This choice of profession speaks to a man who preferred the practical challenges of commerce to the ideological fervor that consumed his half-brother. Perhaps most tellingly, when the Nazi Party was in its infancy and family connections might have provided significant advantages, Alois Jr. made a decision that reveals his fundamental rejection of his half-brother's movement. He briefly joined the Nazi Party in 1926, but left soon after. This brief flirtation with Nazi membership, followed by quick departure, suggests either an attempt to understand his half-brother's movement or perhaps pressure to show family loyalty, but ultimately, his conscience or practical sense prevailed. Throughout the the rise of the Third Reich, Alois Jr. maintained a careful distance from his increasingly powerful half-brother. He had minimal involvement with his half-brother's regime. This deliberate non-involvement was likely both a matter of personal choice and practical necessity. Any significant role in the Nazi government would have drawn attention to the family relationships that all parties seemed eager to downplay. When the war ended and the reckoning began, Alois Jr. faced the same scrutiny as other Hitler family members. Arrested by British forces post-war, but released when it became evident he had no role in his brother's regime. The relatively quick release suggests that investigators found no evidence of meaningful collaboration with Nazi crimes, a testament to Alois Jr.'s successful strategy of distance and non-involvement. Like other Hitler relatives, Alois Jr. eventually chose to modify his identity to escape the burden of his surname. He changed his name to Alois Hiller and lived quietly in Hamburg. The subtle alteration of the surname represents a middle path between complete identity abandonment and defiant retention of the original name, enough change to provide some distance, but not so much as to constitute a total rejection of family identity. Alois Jr. died on May 20, 1956, at age 74. His death marked the end of a life spent successfully navigating the impossible challenge of being Hitler's brother while maintaining personal integrity and safety. His story demonstrates that it was possible, with careful choices and considerable luck, to survive the Nazi era as a Hitler family member without becoming complicit in its crimes. While Alois Jr. managed to build a life of quiet anonymity, the children he left behind would face their own unique challenges in carrying forward the modified Hitler bloodline into the modern era, particularly his American descendants, who would grapple with questions of identity and responsibility in the new world. Alexander Adolf Stuart Houston, the social worker seeking redemption. In the quiet suburbs of Long Island, New York, lives a man who carries perhaps the most complex burden of identity in the modern world. Alexander Adolf Stuart Houston, born in 1949, is now 76 years old and worked as a social worker in New York. He is the eldest son of William Patrick Hitler, making him Adolf Hitler's grandnephew, and remarkably, he is one of only 5 surviving male descendants of the Hitler bloodline as of 2023. Growing up as Hitler's grandnephew in post-war America presented unique challenges that few people could understand. Unlike his grandfather's generation, who had lived through the rise and fall of the Third Reich, Alexander came of age during the Cold War era, when the full scope of the Holocaust was becoming widely known. Alexander has spoken publicly to deny a formal family pact to remain childless, though he acknowledged discussions about their heritage. The question of a supposed pact among Hitler's descendants has become one of the most intriguing aspects of the family's post-war story. According to author David Gardner, who wrote extensively about the Hitler family, there had been informal discussions among the surviving relatives about the responsibility that came with their bloodline. According to David Gardner, author of the 2001 book The Last of the Hitlers, they didn't sign a pact, but what they did is they talked amongst themselves, talked about the burden they've had in the background of their lives, and decided that none of them would marry, none of them would have children. Alexander's public denial of a formal agreement provides crucial insight into the family's thinking. Alexander, a social worker since 2002, said that contrary to this speculation, there was no intentional pact to end the Hitler bloodline. His clarification suggests that while family members may have made individual decisions not to have children, these choices were personal rather than the result of some formal family council. Alexander is now 76 years old, placing him well into his golden years and making him one of the eldest surviving Hitler descendants. His age gives his words particular weight, as he has lived through the entire post-war period and witnessed how public perception of his family has evolved over the decades. Alexander's willingness to speak publicly about these family discussions represents a significant departure from the silence that has characterized most Hitler descendants. But Alexander is not alone in carrying this burden. His younger brothers have chosen their own paths of quiet anonymity, including one who found solace in working with the earth itself. Louis Stuart Houston, the landscaper building Beauty from Shame. On the lawns and carefully tended gardens of Long Island, there works a man whose daily labor represents perhaps the most poetic form of redemption imaginable for someone bearing the Hitler bloodline. Louis Stuart Houston, born in 1951, now 74 years old, runs a landscaping business with his brother Brian on Long Island. As the second son of William Patrick Hitler and brother to Alexander Adolf Stuart Houston, Louis has chosen a life dedicated to creating beauty rather than destroying it. Louis's birth in 1951 placed him in the first generation of Hitler descendants to grow up entirely in the post-war post-war world. Unlike his father William Patrick, who had lived in Nazi Germany and fought against it, or even his older brother Alexander, who was born just 4 years after the war's end, Louis came into the world at a time when the immediate trauma of World War II was beginning to fade into historical memory. This generational distance from the war's immediate aftermath may have provided him with a different perspective on his family burden. Louis runs a landscaping business with his brother Brian on Long Island, and this partnership speaks to the close bonds that seem to characterize the Stuart Houston family. Working together, the two brothers have built a business that serves their community while allowing them to maintain the privacy and anonymity they clearly value. The landscaping industry provides an ideal cover for those seeking to avoid public attention. It's honest work that serves a real need, but it doesn't require the kind of public visibility that might invite unwanted questions about family history. Like all the Stuart Houston brothers, Louis has remained unmarried and childless. The 5 surviving descendants as of 2023, Peter Raubal, Heiner Hochegger, Alexander, Louis, and Brian Stuart Houston, are all men in their 60s to 90s, unmarried and childless. At 74 years old, Louis has clearly made the same decision as his brothers to let the Hitler bloodline end with their generation. This choice, while perhaps personally difficult, represents a form of historical responsibility that few families have ever had to contemplate. Louis's commitment to privacy is absolute. Unlike his brother Alexander, who has occasionally spoken to the media about the family situation, Louis has maintained complete silence about his heritage. At 74, Louis Stuart Houston continues his quiet work across the suburban landscapes of Long Island, carrying with him the knowledge that he is among the last generation to bear even the modified Hitler bloodline. While Louis has found peace in nurturing gardens, his younger brother Brian has chosen an even more radical form of anonymity, becoming perhaps the most invisible of all Hitler descendants. Brian William Stuart Houston, the Invisible Man of Long Island. In the sprawling suburbs of Long Island, where perfectly manicured lawns stretch as far as the eye can see, there works a man whose very profession seems to mock the agricultural fantasies of his great-uncle's blood and soil ideology. Brian William Stuart Houston, born in 1965, is now 60 years old and cooperates a landscaping business. As the youngest of William Patrick Hitler's 4 sons, Brian represents the final generation of Hitler descendants born in the 20th century, and his choice of career and lifestyle embodies the deliberate ordinariness that the family has embraced in their quest for total anonymity. Brian's birth year, 1965, places him in a unique historical position among Hitler's descendants. Born 20 years after the end of World War II, he belongs to the first generation of the family to grow up with no living memory of the war or its immediate aftermath. While his older brothers Alexander and Louis came of age during the 1960s and 1970s when World War II was still within recent memory, Brian's formative years occurred during the 1980s, when the war had become historical rather than contemporary. Brian cooperates the landscaping business and lives privately, a description that captures the essence of the life strategy adopted by most Hitler descendants. The landscaping business represents honest physical labor that creates beauty rather than destruction. There's something almost poetic about Hitler's great-grandnephew, spending his days nurturing plants and designing gardens, creating living spaces that bring joy and tranquility to families across Long Island. Brian's age, 60, places him at a crucial juncture in life where questions about legacy and inheritance become particularly acute. As he enters his 7th decade, he presumably faces the same fundamental question that has confronted all Hitler descendants: whether to have children and continue the bloodline or to let it end with his generation. The fact that Brian remains unmarried and childless at age 60 strongly suggests that he has made the same choice as his brothers and the other Hitler descendants. As Brian continues his work across the suburban landscapes of Long Island, he carries with him the knowledge that he may be among the last generation to bear even the modified Hitler bloodline. His quiet dedication to his craft and his absolute commitment to privacy represent a form of dignity that the Hitler name has rarely enjoyed. While Brian represents the ultimate anonymity among Hitler's American descendants across the Atlantic Ocean, other family members have faced their own challenges in dealing with the notorious family legacy. Peter Raubal, the Austrian engineer who inherited silence. In the picturesque Austrian city of Linz, where the Danube River winds through landscapes that once inspired a young Adolf Hitler's artistic ambitions, lives a man who carries one of the most direct genetic connections to history's most infamous figure. Peter Raubal, now in his 90s, became a retired engineer in Linz, Austria, and has kept a low profile. As the son of Leo Rudolf Raubal Jr. and grandson of Angela Hitler, Peter represents the Austrian branch of the Hitler family tree, those who remained in the homeland where it all began. Peter's birth in 1931 placed him in an extraordinary historical position. Born just 2 years before his great-uncle Adolf Hitler seized power in Germany, Peter spent his earliest years during the rise of the Third Reich. Unlike the American Stuart Houston brothers who grew up in democratic freedom, Peter's childhood unfolded in the very heart of Nazi Europe, making his experience of the family burden fundamentally different from his distant cousins across the Atlantic. Peter's experience during the war years would have been particularly complex given his family connections. As the great-nephew of Adolf Hitler, he might have been expected to enjoy certain privileges within Nazi society. However, the family's complicated relationship with the regime, particularly after various members fell out of favor or were captured, meant that Peter likely experienced the war as a source of confusion and anxiety rather than pride or advantage. When his father Leo was finally released from Soviet captivity in 1955, Peter was already 24 years old, a young man who had grown up essentially fatherless during the most crucial years of his development. The reunion between father and son must have been both joyful and deeply complicated, as Leo returned from 12 years in Soviet labor camps to find his child had become an adult in his absence. Now, in his 90s, Peter Raubal stands as one of the oldest surviving Hitler descendants. His advanced age makes him a crucial repository of family memories from the Nazi era, yet his commitment to silence means that these memories will likely die with him. The 5 surviving descendants as of 2023, Peter Raubal, Heiner Hochegger, Alexander, Louis, and Brian Stuart Houston, are all men in their 60s to 90s, unmarried and childless. Like all the surviving Hitler descendants, Peter has remained unmarried and childless, meaning that when he dies, another direct line to the Hitler family will be permanently severed. Thanks for watching. Check out other cards on the screen.